So when we proclaim the name of Jesus, power is released.
Welcome to New Dawn Community Church, the message of the week with Pastor Randall Cutter.
We are in the book of Acts in our continuing study of the book of Acts. So if you want to open up your Bible to the book of Acts, chapter 7, we are in the midst of our study of Stephen's trial. Stephen, one of the seven. That's what he's called in the Bible, one of the seven. We call him one of the first deacons, but that's not a biblical description of those seven individuals. They're never called deacons. They serve a role that we in our churches might say are deacons, but deacons are really those who serve to help take the load off of the apostles or the leaders. And so deacons can be something that is in a bunch of different, they can do a lot of different services. The Bible never really talks about the specific thing they do. We just know that they make sure that the leaders are supposed to be focused on their things, so they take care of the other things. Stephen and the other six were the seven because they were the first ones that were called to this service type of role. Stephen was one who had a great gift of teaching and sharing, and as he went out and fulfilled his job of taking care of the widows, the Greek-speaking widows, he found himself running into problems with the people who normally had interacted with those widows before they became Christian. And that would be the Greek-speaking Jewish people who were living in Jerusalem. He was doing signs and wonders and miracles. And, if you ever get the idea that if you're involved in signs, wonders, and miracles, that it means everyone's going to accept you and be amazed, don't. It's not the way it works. People, first of all, will begin to say that really didn't happen. That was just a coincidence. That was a freak thing. And then there'll be others who are absolutely angry at you. And that's what happened to Stephen. He is out doing the will of God in an amazing way. And there is a group that stands up to oppose him in the synagogue of the freedmen, which was a Greek-speaking synagogue. And Stephen was out dealing with former members of that synagogue. And so they ran into him and they started to have debates. They could not best him in debates. So some of the less noble characters there decided to bring in false witnesses to accuse him of blasphemy, basically. And so they drag him before the Sanhedrin and they attack him publicly. And Stephen's defense is where we are at right now, as he is answering the charges which are against him. Today we are in the second part the second session that we are in on his actual message. Our theme today is receiving those God calls. One of the main themes of Stephen's message is that you guys always reject the servants of God. That's one of his themes. His other theme is God meets us wherever we are, because the accusation against him was the fact that he was saying that the temple was going to be destroyed. The accusation was he said Jesus was going to destroy the temple. And if you remember in Matthew 24, Jesus had said the temple's not going to last. And so they were saying that now Stephen was saying Jesus is going to destroy the temple. And the temple was certainly going to be destroyed. However, they were using it against him to be able to say he was attacking the land and the temple. So Stephen's message today is receive those God has called. And you guys haven't done that. You're supposed to receive those when God calls them. And not really the case with Jesus or, of course, with Stephen himself. So we are in Acts chapter 7, verses 17 to 36. Just a reminder, this is my translation of the Greek language. Most of it's pretty similar today with what's in front of you, whether you've got the NIV or the NASB or the other versions, your favorite versions. But I always encourage you to have your own favorite translation open in front of you so that you can see the nuances or the differences. If there's anything of note today, of course, I always mention where I've translated it differently. So we are in Acts chapter 7 right now, verses 17 to 19, as Stephen continues his defense. He has already talked about Joseph and the people of Israel being put into the 400 years of captivity in Egypt. He had started with Joseph. You guys have rejected Joseph. He had then gone on to be able to say, hey, you rejected Joseph even though God used him in Egypt. He had started by saying, look, God met Abraham in Mesopotamia. God doesn't need our land or our temple to meet and talk to his people. And he used Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees. He used Joseph in Egypt. And you rejected Joseph, and you ended up, because you rejected him, in Egypt for 400 years. The very things that God had said to Abraham would happen. So he didn't tell them how they were going to get to Egypt, and part of it was because they rejected Joseph. So these were the charges which were against Stephen. He was speaking against the temple and the land, saying Jesus would destroy the temple land and the land. And he was speaking against the law, saying Jesus would change it. Well, both those charges are true. I mean, as far as the temple would end up being destroyed, and he certainly was creating a new covenant and changing the customs which were handed down by Moses. How do we know that's true? Anybody eat pork this morning? Anybody wearing mixed fabrics this morning? I dare say that's all of us, because that we would not be able to do if we were still living under the covenant or the commands of the Mosaic Code. I mean, that's just 2 of the 613 different commands that we would find ourselves under. Was there a change? Yeah, of course. And so that was something that was very evident. So anyway, when the time of the promise God had given Abraham drew near, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt. This is about 300 years already that they're in Egypt. You know, sometimes I tell people, there was an article written about us in our move. You can find it on my Facebook page and link to it. That article talks about how it took us 25 years to find a facility. And of course, it didn't take us 25 years to find a facility. It took us 25 years to walk through the plan of God to be able to get to the place that we're buying a facility that was built for us back in 2005. It just took the owner that long to figure out he's supposed to sell it to us. So anyway, but so it says after 25 years, and one of the things I say is that, for a long season from 1995 to 2011, we were very comfortable where we were. We had a 13,000 square foot facility. The rent comparison, the downstairs here is 5,500 square feet, plus the upstairs is about another 2,000 square feet. So, when you think about, now it's not double the size, but it's getting close, and we had a big fellowship hall and big education rooms. Our nursery was multiple rooms. I mean, we had one room. One whole bay of the place was just storage. I mean, it was just amazing, the space that we had. The rent was not a challenge. It wasn't that challenging compared to about half of what we have now. And so it was just so comfortable from 1995 all the way to 2011. And that comfort was a trap. Because we weren't looking aggressively for properties or facilities during that time. And we suddenly realized, the culture's changing. If we don't get out of this facility, we're not going to find, people are not going to commit to coming in our door. Doesn't matter how much they like us and as we witness or whatever, it was a commitment to come through a door and then go up an elevator and getting into a second floor. It was the whole second floor of a building. It was only a 2-story building. And so we realized, we need to do something different, and we moved here. And by the way, in some ways, this building has also created the same type of thing. The culture has changed. This plaza has changed. In 2011, it was beautiful, but because of the fact it's being focused on to tear down for redevelopment, they're not putting the money into it. And so the paint is faded, and it's just, the parking lot isn't being kept up. And again, it's difficult for people who are looking at this facility to say, this is a place I actually want to commit to. And so we knew it was time, besides the fact that they're going to redevelop it, that it was getting to the place where, we can feel the shift in the culture again, and not just the culture, but the fact that this place is feeling run down. Not inside, but outside. And so, but in Israel, the same thing happened. They were for 300 years. They were there. They got very comfortable. Goshen was a nice place. They had the best of the land. They went to Goshen and they grew and they prospered there, and things went along. And then it says after approximately 300 years, they had a population explosion. The rabbis talk about this. And they talk about the way that the Jewish people, and they try to figure out how you could go from, the 75 that went down 300 years earlier, and all of a sudden, at the end of this thing, have about 2 million people. And it just means a huge population explosion was going on. And so they figure out some unreal numbers as you go along because of their assumptions. But there was a major population explosion, which Israel was suddenly getting prepared to be able to go back into the promised land. And so the Lord set those things up. And then at that time, it says, right at that time, another king arose who did not know Joseph. Now, those of you that know Egyptian history, that'd be like 3 of you? Okay. The assumption is that the Hyksos kingdom was what Joseph went into. And they were Egyptian invaders. Some of you are saying, I know that name, but I can't quite remember how it all works together. There were invaders that came in and took over, and the thought is just took over that northern part of Egypt. And so it became like this tension that was going on. There was still Egypt, and then there was Egypt to the north, which was the Hyksos, and that's where Joseph was. And, a major part of Egypt, but not the whole thing. And then eventually, the two parts reunited again. Because they were both Egyptian in their basic way of doing things. And so one dynasty ended and the Hyksos were gone. And that means the people that knew who Joseph was were gone too. Which means that the favor, because remember, Joseph would have been a national hero, just like we think back to the people that lived 250 years ago and say, wow, national heroes, they would have been thinking of Joseph the same way, but suddenly that institutional memory was erased. Remember what happened when they'd have dynasty changes in Egypt? They would scrub the statues, the monuments. They would totally erase the memory of the land so that people wouldn't look back to the former rulers. They would just look at the current rulers. And so that type of thing happened, and they erased the memory of Joseph, which means the Israelites simply became a growing population that were not Egyptian in their midst. And there was always the concern that they would ally themselves with foreign invaders like the Hyksos again and create problems. And so politically, they were a problem. And so the thought is that this was now a post-Hyksos king. And the king decided to deal with the people of Israel. He took advantage of our people, Stephen says. He mistreated our fathers, forcing them to expose their infants so that they would not survive. So, he took advantage of them, he mistreated them, and he forced the exposure of infants. Now, he took advantage of them. He said, hey, we've got this huge population. Just imagine what we could do if we forced them into slave labor. Think of the cities we could build. And they built Ramses, that's the shortened name of Pi Ramses, blah, blah, blah. But they were being used to build the Egyptian empire while they were there. He took advantage of them. Then he mistreated them because he was trying to stop them. They were still a major threat, so he wanted to put them down because they were politically a problem. And because they were still growing, remember when he first went to the midwives? This we get from the book of Exodus. He went to the midwives and says, you need to kill these infants when they are born. And the midwives made up a story and said, before we get there, these Hebrew women are so vigorous that they have the babies before we get there. And God blessed them because they would not kill the Israelite babies. And then Pharaoh just said, well, okay, any newborn baby, expose them. Put them in the Nile is the way it's described in the book of Exodus. In Stephen's day and age, exposure was a very common practice. That's what they called it, exposure. Even though it is not called exposure back in the book of Exodus, when Stephen says, force them to expose their infants, by the way, that's the Greek, expose their infants, everyone knew exactly what that meant because it was happening throughout the Roman world and the Greek world. The heads of the household had full authority over the infants born into their household. And if an infant was born that was inconvenient, they would simply say, expose them. Now, there were two ways that you exposed an infant. Number one, well, there are more than two, but number one, you would take them, that infant would then just be ushered out of the house and taken to a place where infants who were not wanted were normally left. And then people who wanted a child could come by and take the infant. If no one wanted the child, the infant didn't last very long. It didn't last very long. That's exposing an infant. If the person did not want their heir to still be around, they'd say expose them outside the city walls. And then, of course, the animals and the elements would get to the baby very quickly. If you were especially cruel, you would put them out there naked, because then they had even less protection. And so it was just the normal way of dealing with unwanted births. In 1 BC, there was a military man who was writing back to his wife, and it's really chilling. This was in one of the papyri that we have. He's talking to his wife. I beg and entreat you, take care of the little one. They have one child already. And as soon as we receive our pay, I will send it up to you. If by chance you bear a child, because he had just been deployed, and so she could be pregnant. If by chance you bear a child, if it is a boy, let it be. If it's a girl, expose it. So that was just population control from the mines. This is just the husband saying to the wife, now, oh, by the way, if you have a child and it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, expose it, put it out there. So very common. So when Stephen says that, they forced us to expose our children, that is very common. Everyone knows exactly. He doesn't have to say they forced us to throw our kids in the Nile. He just referred to the Roman custom, and everyone knew exactly what he meant. Very hard-hearted. You had to steel yourself against the infants. So Moses was born at a strategic time, and he was beautiful to God. He was raised for 3 months in his father's home. Then when he was exposed, the daughter of Pharaoh took him and raised him as her own son. Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of Egypt. He was powerful in his words and his achievements. So now, about 300 is when the Israelites started to really expand in populace. The new king showed up, began to mistreat them, use them to be able to build their cities, and at a strategic time. And the Greek word is kairos. There's chronos is a word which talks about time, and then obviously chronometer and all those things, we get our words from it. And then there's kairos, and kairos can mean more of a strategic time. And at just the strategic time, Moses is born, because God's got a deliverance to take place, right? He told Abraham 400 years in captivity, so Moses has to be born at a significant time, and we know he was born 350 years after they arrived in Egypt. How do we know this? Because he led Israel out of Egypt when he was 80 years old, 430 years after they arrived. And so you just subtract 80. We know he was born 350 years after they arrived. He was beautiful to God. That's, by the way, the literal Greek, the literal expression of the Greek language. Many translations will say he was, whatever. He had favor, he had whatever. But beautiful to God is actually what it means. It could mean favored by God. We really don't know. It's not an expression which is used a lot, but it means God was looking at him saying, this is my plan and my purpose, and God's plans and purpose are beautiful. And so Moses was beautiful to God. His parents raised him for 3 months, but they were forced to expose him because the child was getting too big and it was too dangerous, and the Egyptians would have killed him anyway, and then probably the rest of the family. You know how they would enforce, if you violated their law, there was going to be some teeth in it that made it untenable for you. Perhaps any children you had, they would kill, as opposed to just the one child. And so they forced him to be exposed after 3 months. We know about Pharaoh's daughter raising him. She found him in the Nile. The sister was watching to see what was going on. Again, that was exposing him, putting him out to see what would happen, and he was adopted. But he was adopted by the most unlikely person, because the Lord had set things up so that Pharaoh's daughter would be there and would adopt him. And so he was raised as a prince of Egypt. And that's amazing, because it means, as it said, he was versed in all of the wisdom of Egypt. And not only was he versed in all the wisdom of Egypt, he was designed by God to be able to thrive in that environment. And Stephen says he became powerful in his speech and his deeds. Now, some of the rabbis before Stephen, he went so far as to say that Moses was the cultural leader of the people of Egypt. He pretty much created all of what was going on in Egypt because he was a man who was powerful in word and speech. They're probably getting a little bit fanciful, but it is just think, this is a guy that everyone knew. This is a person who, when he spoke, people listened, and he had authority as a prince in Egypt. And his activities and his achievements were very powerful. For him to identify with the Israelites, an amazing humbling of himself. However, he didn't do it right. When he was 40 years old, that's what Stephen tells us, and of course we know from the math, when he was 40 years old, a desire rose in his heart to visit his brothers, the sons of Israel. When he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance on the one mistreating him, striking the Egyptian down. Moses thought his brothers would understand that God was giving them deliverance through his hand, but they did not understand. Here's the theme. The theme is, you're always rejecting your leaders. And he's pointing it out. So, Moses was 40 years old, which means 390 years after the arrival in Egypt. They've only got 10 years to go. By the way, everyone in Israel knew about the promise God had made for Abraham. When they started to be mistreated, you can bet they went home at the end of the day and said, only this many years to deliverance. Only this many years to deliverance. At this point in time, only 10 more years to deliverance. In fact, that may be one of the reasons they rejected Moses. They knew their deliverer wasn't going to come for another 10 years. Because God said after 400 years, they would come out. And so Moses, though, started to feel his call. God was stirring up his call as the deliverer of Israel. However, he did not have a call to be a murderer of Egyptians. Think about that. God's stirring up his call. That's the desire that was being put in his heart. And it's God who works in you to will and to do according to his good purposes. He gives you the desire and the ability. So he is got this thing being stirred up. That's God. Because Moses is supposed to be the deliverer of Israel. And he sacrifices. He says, I'm going to identify with them. I'm going to be the deliverer that they need. I'm going to defend them from the mistreatment of the administration, which is his grandpa. And his uncles and everyone else who was involved in it. But he ended up, as he was defending this Israelite, he struck down the Egyptian. He murdered him. He knew God had sent him. He went too far. And God had not. A spirit of murder is not God. A spirit of murder means he was dealing with his own flesh or with satanic influence from whatever was going on around him, but it wasn't God. And it cost him and it cost the people of Israel. You've heard me mention this already. They only were supposed to be in Israel 10 more years. However, Moses needed 40 years in the wilderness to iron all this stuff out of him, which means he couldn't be Israel's deliverer until 430 years after his actions delayed the deliverance. And so Israel got to their 400 years, and they said, we're at 400 years. Where's our deliverer? Well, he's herding sheep over in Midian. And by the time he got done in Midian, he didn't even want to do it anymore. He was like, that was a dream. So anyway, he knew he was, and he knew that God had sent him. He was ready to go. He was just too early, and he went too far. He did something which was totally inappropriate. He murdered an Egyptian. On the next day, he appeared to them as some were fighting. He tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, men, you are brothers. Why are you harming each other? But the one who was hurting his neighbor pushed Moses forcefully away, asking, who made you a ruler and judge over us? You don't want to kill me in the same way you killed the Egyptian yesterday, do you? Remember, we're told in the book of Exodus, Moses looked around before he killed the Egyptian, then he buried him in the sand. And so Moses thinks he's gotten away with this, and all of a sudden he intervenes in this situation. He's acting in his role as defender and reconciler. He wants to be defender and reconciler. Notice there's no murder here, but the guy that he was dealing with thought, are you going to murder me like you did the Egyptian yesterday? And that's why he pushed him away. He was afraid for his life because of what Moses had done. Pushed him away physically. Boy, that's rejection, isn't it? It isn't just we don't want you, it's you push them away. This is about, remember what Stephen's theme is. You reject those whom God sends as deliverers. And Moses was rejected. And his murder was exposed. And suddenly, he's got a problem. Because, he's got to deal with the Egyptians finding out that he had murdered one of theirs. Then, at this question, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the desert of Mount Sinai in the flame of a burning bush. Moses saw it and wondered at the sight. When he drew near to investigate it, the Lord revealed his voice to him. So, Moses has to take off. He has to leave his calling for exile. By the way, if you wonder about the tension between him and the Pharaoh, you can bet there were political voices. Anytime there's politics involved, there's always someone willing to stick the knife in your back. Okay? It's just the way it is. If you're involved in politics, you've got scars. And you better be able to deal with them because of the fact there's always going to be someone who's betraying you, looking for advantage over you. And you can bet as Moses grew powerful in speech and achievements, there were jealous people around him who were saying all the time, watch him, watch him. He's eventually going to take the side of the Israelites. Remember, the king was already afraid of the Israelites joining with their enemies and coming against them. And now they had a natural leader who had been raised up in Pharaoh's own household. You can bet this was a policy issue, that Moses was around, and now he had gone out and he had killed an Egyptian to defend the Israelites. Of course he was going to rise up and lead a rebellion. There was no way you could interpret this in any other way. And so Moses didn't have a choice. He had to leave for exile. The Pharaoh was going to kill him. And again, not because he hated his daughters, and again, it might have been an uncle by this time, but it wasn't because he hated Moses, it's because he was a threat to the national order, because if he rose up with Israel behind him, it was going to be devastating to the Egyptian economy, and perhaps he would lead them in war or a civil rebellion. And so they had to deal with this. They had to stop this right now, and the only way that Moses could live was to take off, and you know the story. He headed on out to the Sinai Peninsula. Some people believe it was actually Arabia, the area there. Doesn't really matter for our purposes. And he went into exile, and he began a new life. He had been powerful prince of Egypt. Everything he said and everything he did was prosperous and successful. And he goes out and he ends up herding sheep in the desert. A little bit of a different change. Instead of having people pouring remember I last week talked about Joseph. Joseph, during the early parts of the famine, was the second most powerful person in Egypt. He'd go home at the end of the day, his servants would wipe the sweat off his brow, and he would sit on his veranda, and they'd put grapes next to his little couch, and they'd pour his wine, and he would sit back and relax, and he'd have his family around him, and he'd have a great time. All that time, back up in Canaan, his brother and his dad and everyone up there was suffering from the effects of the famine and having a hard time surviving. Very difficult time for them, but Joseph down in Egypt was having a great time. Well, Moses, as a prince of the household, also was in that same position. He was pampered, he was the best of the land. It was awesome. And then he suddenly was in exile and found out what dirt tasted like, because that's all he had around him. In Egypt, he had paved places to live and pavement to walk on, and it was marvelous and it was glorious, but now he's out in the middle of the desert and he's learning humility. And you can imagine the regret. You can imagine the regret. I have messed up God's call in my life. You ever feel that? I've messed up God's call in my life. Now, a lot of times, this is just the way it is. A lot of times, because of who we are and the sin nature that's in us, when God begins to call us in something, He stirs up that desire in us. There's almost no way that it can't be mixed with impure motives of some sort, whether it's ambition or misunderstanding just of how things are supposed to be walked forward. Moses obviously had some anger issues, right? I mean, he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. He had some anger issues. And so his anger got the best of him, and he killed the Egyptian as he was trying to deal with the Israelite. And so his issue was anger. God's stirring up a calling in him, and yet he still got this mixture in him that compromises who he is. When God begins to stir in us so we step into our calling, we often mess it up for the same reason. We've got a sin nature. And we haven't yet had the tar beat out of us. I listened to a particular blogger who, and he's Christian, but it's not about Christian stuff. He talks about politics and themes in the United States that are going on, different things. And he said, and just every once in a while he does a throwaway comment. He says, that person's just a little bit too young. Life hasn't beat understanding into them yet. I'm like, that's a brutal way to put it, but that's true. I mean, you live in life for a while and you realize, your own choices, your own regrets, etc. And Moses, life was beating understanding into him. And we have the same issue. We can suddenly, by the time we get done messing something up, when we walk away from it, we honestly can be thinking, I never want to look at that again. That couldn't have been God. That was just me. And there is no way I'm ever doing that thing again because it was humiliating, it was awful, it was costly. And it only took 40 years for God to iron Moses into the person that He needed him to be. And how do we know that God had gotten successful at this? Because when God came to Moses and said, hey, I need you to go in and now fulfill your role, Moses said, send someone else. That was 40 years ago I had this desire that you stirred in me, and now it's dead because I killed it. And I've been here 40 years. I've got my own family. Everything's fine. I'm accustomed to living out here. I do not need to be the deliverer of Israel. You send someone else. Now, God, of course, had a plan. The plan was Moses. But Moses didn't want to do it. So God prepared a fish. Oh, no, that was Jonah. God, this is where God just looks at him and says, go. Now, when God looks at you and says, go, you usually end up going. Because if God says, go, and He just vibrates His voice right, every atom in your body vibrates. You think, well, I think maybe I'll go. I mean, this is the voice of many waters that could, vibrate you into nothingness. So he's got a new life, a new family, and then God moves to reinstate his call, wrecks his plans. He has a retirement plan. He's got a nice herd, sheep. He's enjoying himself. It's not what he had, but he can't go back to that. And so he's going to make the best. God says, go back. And he says, oh, my goodness. And God does this by doing the burning bush thing. He appears to him in the desert. An angel appeared to him in the desert in the flame of a burning bush. Now, it's pretty clear that the angel appears and God speaks. And that's how Stephen is pointing it out. The angel appears, flames of a burning bush, and then he manifests his voice to him. He reveals his voice to him. That means God was speaking to Moses person to person. Remember later on when Miriam and Aaron had a rebellion against Moses? God says, when I deal with prophets, I do dreams and visions and mystery and dark sayings. When I'm with Moses, I speak to him face to face. That started right here. He revealed his voice and had a conversation with him. So anyway, angel shows up. There's a flame. When he drew near to investigate it, the Lord revealed his voice to him. That'll change you. It's not just, I saw this weird thing in the desert. It's God spoke to me. There's a huge difference, isn't there? He says, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses shook with fear and did not dare to investigate it. The Lord said to him, untie the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy land. I have surely seen the suffering of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their groans. I have come to rescue them. Now come, I am sending you to Egypt. This is not great news. Moses is not happy about this. Now, Stephen is about to gloss over all of that argument he has with God. But we can just think about it a moment, because, guys, this is what happens to us. God stirs a calling in us. We mess it up at some level very often. And then what happens is he comes back to us later when we've got all that ambition or whatever it was dealt with and burned out of us. He says, okay, now's the time. And you look at him open mouthed and go, are you out of your mind? I was ready for this back when I was 40. That's Moses, 40. I was ready for this when I was 40. And now I'm too old and over the hill. I'm not doing this. And that's what he said, by the way, send someone else. I'm not doing this. That didn't work. So what we've got now is all I can say is the supernatural presence of God undid Moses, because but even in the midst of the supernatural presence of God, he still resisted. But when God spoke, he was so undone that Moses, it says he went to investigate. And then it says he decided not to investigate. Yeah, I mean, you know what? If you see a bush that's burning and you know, you see this, something's going on in it, the angel's appearing, I'm going to investigate this. And all of a sudden God speaks to him and he goes, oh, I'm not doing that anymore. And he backs up in terror, really, because he can hear the voice of the Almighty. And that will undo you. And the Lord said, untie your sandals. This is holy land. I know it says holy ground in the Hebrew text back in Exodus, but what's Stephen's point? God can meet you in whatever land you find yourself. And the Greek word, of the several hundred times that it shows up in the New Testament, means land or locality about 98% of the time. And Stephen chooses, there were some perfectly good words that he could have used to talk about the dirt underneath his feet. He chose not to use them. He used a word which would be the same word you would use if you were talking about the land of Israel or the land of Egypt or all of the other lands. And he's making a huge point. He's speaking against this land. Stephen says, God spoke to Abraham in Mesopotamia, and he spoke to Joseph in Egypt. He gave him dreams and visions, and now he's speaking to Moses in the wilderness, and he says, that's holy land. You know, they probably should have picked up stones right now to take care of Stephen, because what he just said was fighting words. Because he was having God say, it's not just Jerusalem, the eternal city, that is holy to me. Holy is wherever I am. And that for us is an amazing statement. By the way, as a member of the Greek-speaking diaspora, all those who had been scattered in the scattering of the Jews throughout the Roman and Greek world, they had a far more developed understanding of this than the people of Judea did, because they had to meet God where they were. They would have to still come to the Passover festival, and they didn't do that every year. They could not. And so they had a well-developed theology of God being able to meet them wherever they are. And so Stephen already understood this, which is why he was a bit even ahead of the disciples in his understanding of how God was going to work with people outside of Jerusalem, because he had that experience of God. And here he says, God puts the words in God's mouth. This is holy land, which is certainly, the word he chose was a legitimate choice. He's just making sure he's driving the point home. This is not the only holy land. That's an interesting statement right there. But the place that you are standing is holy land. And now, guess what? It's time to fulfill your calling. It's about 30 years late, but get with the program. So Stephen, not dealing with all of Moses' angst at this particular point in time, says, this is the Moses whom they rejected, saying, who appointed you ruler and judge? God sent him as ruler and liberator by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. This man led them out by doing wonders and signs in the land of Egypt, in the Red Sea, and in the desert for 40 years. So Stephen doesn't waste any time. He's already hammered them with the Holy Land. This is Holy Land. And you know, the Holy Land, right? So he says the Holy Land was not Israel. It was where God was with Moses. That was Holy Land. By the way, that would have been Sinai. That would have been the other, there's a, Mount Horeb. Okay, I got that. That was the same mountain. And so it's Holy Land. When Elijah wanted to meet with God and he was running away from his calling, guess where he went? The same place that God reinstituted Moses' calling. And Elijah resigned his calling there. It was very symbolic of the fact that he went back to the Holy Land where God said, I'm giving you your calling. And Elijah resigns his calling right there on that Holy Land. So Stephen's point, of course, is Israel's rejecting another deliverer. They rejected him, and yet God sent him by the hand of an angel to go back. I mean, his role was vindicated by the angels, by signs, by wonders, and we know the story, and we know about the 10 plagues, and we know about how God led them through the Red Sea, and we know all of those things, the manna and all those things that would be coming as he spoke a little bit more about Moses. And he said, hey, his role was also demonstrated over 40 years. And guess what? You guys rejected him. Our fathers rejected him. Which means we're not very good at identifying those whom God calls. By the way, I don't think much has changed. I'm pretty certain that today, many of the people that God calls are rejected. Because I don't think human nature has changed. I think it's more in us to reject those God calls than to accept them or receive them. That's why the theme to today's message was receiving those that God has called. And I don't know what there is in human nature. Well, I really do. There's this thing where we're threatened by those who rise above. It's the way it is. And it's kind of like if you have a whole field of sunflowers and one sunflower comes up against all the rest, above all the rest, it's like that's a threat. Why are you above us? And so it's just the mindset in human nature of pulling down those who are getting ahead. I've heard that crabs, when you put them in you're fishing for crabs. Some of you may have experience with this. But I have been told that you can put crabs into a container and not put a cover on it. Because as soon as one starts to get to the top, to be able to get out, the rest of them will pull him back. And that really describes humanity. Whether the story's true or not, the sentiment of it makes perfect sense. It's like as soon as someone starts to get ahead, people are threatened. And we need to make sure that we're not threatened by God, those that God raises up as deliverers. We have to be those who are hearing by the Spirit of God and not from our flesh. Our flesh will always be threatened by those whom God raises up as deliverers. Always. The issue is, are we hearing the Spirit of God? Look at the deliverers that God has released down through history. Joseph was a kid who was squealing on his brothers. They couldn't stand the idea of him being raised up to be a deliverer. Moses was a murderer. You think of King David, he was a murderer. Samson, let's not even talk about him. I mean, every one of the deliverers that God raises up, there's usually some reason you can reject him. And that should teach us something. If we're looking for deliverers that God is raising up, be assured that there's going to be a pretty good reason to reject them in your own mind. The issue is going to be, let's look at the deliverers that God has raised up in the past and say, what type of character did they have? And sometimes those characters were very unlovely. But God bent them to his will anyway. Receiving those whom God calls, it's incumbent on us to be people who are hearing from the Spirit of God as he raises up deliverers and not those who are so quickly prone to reject those whom God has called. That's Stephen's point to the people of Israel. It's a point that we have to take to our hearts today. And I'm going to pray that we, as God's people, are always able to hear the deliverers. In the case of the people sitting in front of Stephen, they were rejecting the Messiah. Jesus had come to fulfill all the promises of Messiah. He had come to be the God-man who would pay for the sins of the world, who would give us the opportunity to have fellowship with the Father in heaven again through faith in him. He was the one that you didn't want to reject. He was the perfect one without spot or blemish, and yet he could still be rejected. Not because he lacked, but because they lacked and were threatened. Boy, pay attention to that. That's something that... By the way, did they want to reject the Messiah? Oh, no. But they did. That should tell us something about our nature. Let's pray. Father, I am asking today that we would never reject those whom you raise up as our deliverers. I ask, Lord, that you would give us insight and wisdom in your Spirit. Obviously, we know in ourselves that our flesh will usually reject the people that you raise up. I am asking that we would see beyond our flesh and we'd be able to step into the fullness of everything you have for us as a result. I pray in your name, Jesus. Amen.